Welcome to Chapter 3 of Pirkei Avot. And today I want to take a deep dive with you into the ideas of free will, destiny, and divine human partnership. As we all know, the name Israel means struggles with God. But today I want to talk about how that relationship between humans and God can be less adversarial and more cooperative, and especially in how that cooperation impacts the way we understand our own responsibilities. Here in Chapter 3, we have a lot of verses that extol the importance of studying Torah, and not only studying Torah, but balancing the study of Torah with practical life and practical needs. There's a whole sequence by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, where he goes into these sort of, what appear to be these sort of seemingly paradoxical intertwining of Torah and practical life. It begins with a phrase, Im ein Torah, ein derech eretz, v'im ein derech eretz, ein Torah. Without Torah, there are no manners, civil society, civil discourse. And without manners, civil society, civil discourse, there is no Torah. He then has an even more practical verse where he says, Im ein kemach, ein Torah, v'im ein Torah, ein kemach. If there is no flour meaning bread, sustenance, there is no Torah. But if there's no Torah, then there's also no flour. And the basic understanding of these verses is to say that it's actually impossible to learn Torah, of course, without being able to support oneself. We don't have an ascetic tradition in Judaism where we have monks going off to live in an ivory tower. Judaism is very based on not just studying Torah, but interacting with the world around you and supporting yourself and supporting others. And then, of course, there's the other aspect of that, which is obviously there are billions of people on earth who are sustaining themselves every day without studying Torah. But this is getting to that deeper spiritual need that we're not just asking ourselves how we should support ourselves, but why we should support ourselves. This whole sequence is, pointing at, I think, something deeper, though, than just practical versus spiritual needs. To me, that's a very obvious reading of this, but I think it misses the real distinction. The real distinction I think that these verses are diving into is what in our lives comes from God and what in our lives comes from us. The distinction underneath that one goes to something even more significant. What in our lives can we control and what in our lives is beyond our control? And then there's the truly terrifying question underneath that one. Is God actually protecting us? Do we have the ability to protect and sustain ourselves? Or are we all basically doomed? This is something I think a lot of us in the Jewish community are thinking about right now, not only in our private lives, as we always do whenever we face challenges, but also in terms of the threats that our communities are now facing, both in Israel and around the world. I think there's often a feeling of inevitability in the ubiquity of hatred against the Jewish people and the ideas of those who would hope to destroy us. There's this sense that we talked about during the holiday of Purim of the goral, the lot that befalls our people. And I think that this is something that a lot of us in the Jewish community are struggling with. As many of you know, I wrote a book called People Love Dead Jews, so I'm very, very much a prophet of doom. But what I want to focus on today is actually a different Mishnah in this chapter from Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva actually lays out for us a very profound way through the paradox of free will and destiny. Hakol tzafui v'harashut netuna. Everything is foreseen, and freedom of choice is granted. Uvetov ha'olam nidon, v'hakol lefi rov ha'ma'aseh. And the world is judged in goodness, and everything is according to the preponderance of deed. Those first few words, Hakol tzafui v'harashut netuna, everything is foreseen and freedom of choice is granted, those first few words drove me crazy when I was a teenager because they are logically impossible. How can there be free will if everything is foreseen? Doesn't that imply that free will is an illusion? And as a younger student, I was always looking for ways to smooth out this paradox. And at one point I remember finding some commentator who explained it by saying that we could imagine God as someone who's almost like a lookout sitting at the top of a cliff, looking down into a ravine with many different pathways with hikers traversing the ravine. The idea was that the lookout is looking down and can see the different paths that these different hikers are taking and all the various choices those hikers are making, and can see the outcome of those choices, where they'll end up if they follow whichever path they choose. But from the hiker's point of view, they can't see that. They feel that they're always making a free choice, and they don't know the outcome. This used to satisfy me. But now I see this as actually kind of a belittling idea that doesn't actually capture the grandeur of what Rabbi Akiva is really saying here. I think that Akiva is saying something much more profound about this double helix between destiny and free will. The Rambam, the 12th century philosopher Moses Maimonides, comes a little bit closer. The Rambam discusses this paradox in the book of Exodus. In the Exodus story, we're told at first that Pharaoh hardened his heart and wouldn't let the Jews leave slavery. But later in the story, we're told that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, which makes the divine punishment for not letting the Jews go seem kind of unfair. But the Rambam explains it this way. Imagine that you're at a crossroads between path A and path B. When you are standing at that intersection, you have an exactly equal choice. You can take one step down path A or one step down path B. But once you take one step down path A, you no longer have an equal choice between continuing on path A or going back to path B. And every step you take down path A makes it that much harder to return and go to path B, until you get to a point where eventually it becomes not technically impossible, but realistically impossible for you to return to path B. And this is the pattern that the Rambam describes as Pharaoh hardening his own heart and then God hardening Pharaoh's heart. He describes this as simply a consequence of Pharaoh's previous choices. We see this pattern all the time. When I first learned this passage from Rambam, I remember thinking it reminded me of Shakespeare's Macbeth. At the beginning of the play Macbeth, the character Macbeth is agonizing over whether or not to kill the King Duncan. And a huge part of the play is taken up with this agonizing decision. A few acts later, though, Macbeth is again faced with the opportunity to commit a murder, and he just does it like that. He doesn't even debate or think about it. And I think that this is a pattern that we see, hopefully not involving murder, but that we see always in our own personal lives, in the kinds of choices we make, and how our habits become more and more ingrained until they don't even feel like choices anymore. But I think that even this understanding of fate and free will, where fate is essentially a product of free will, I think still feels inadequate to the depth of what Rabbi Akiva is saying here. To really touch that depth, we need to go earlier in the Torah, to the story that actually brought our ancestors to Egypt. The story in the Torah of how the people of Israel arrived in Egypt seems on its surface to be a story about destiny. Joseph is the great-grandson of Abraham, the founder of the Jewish people, and Joseph is a person who's really good at interpreting dreams. After his own ill-fated misfortunes in Egypt, he's called out of prison in Egypt to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. And in this context, these dreams are presented as visions for the future, suggesting that they are presenting material that's going to be inevitable. Pharaoh is dreaming about 7 fat cows coming out of the Nile. Then 7 thin cows come out of the Nile and eat those fat cows. He then has a very similar dream involving sheaves of grain. And Joseph interprets these dreams to mean that there are going to be 7 good years of harvests in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. To us as moderns, this story seems to require us to suspend our disbelief and accept that dreams are some sort of magical fortune-telling prediction of the future. But let's pause for a minute and consider another possibility. Maybe these are anxiety dreams. Pharaoh lives in a country with one water source. Good years are years where the Nile vastly overflows, and bad years are years when the Nile barely overflows. Pharaoh lives here. He's aware of this pattern, and he's worried about it. So when Joseph presents his interpretation to Pharaoh of these dreams, the novelty isn't that Joseph tells him that there's going to be good years and there's going to be bad years. Pharaoh knows that. The novelty is that Joseph says to Pharaoh, "You know what I think you should do? Maybe you should save some of the food from the good years so that you have something to eat during the bad years. And Pharaoh's response to this suggestion in the text is, wow, you're a genius. Let's make you the second in command of the entire kingdom. He's so blown away by this man's brilliant insight. And I remember reading this story when I was younger and thinking, like, Pharaoh, are you that dumb? Why didn't you think of this? You live here. And I now understand that Pharaoh was living in a culture that was this polytheistic, fatalistic civilization where the gods do all kinds of unpredictable things that are unfathomable to people, and people are supposed to just accept it. But Joseph is already part of a tradition where God is expecting humans to partner with God. In Joseph's tradition, God created nature and the world, and part of that world that God created is Joseph's brain. You're given circumstances, but you're also given talents and abilities and wisdom to take action in those circumstances. And not only do you have the ability to take action, you even have the responsibility to take action and change those circumstances. Hakol tzafui v'harashut netuna. Everything is foreseen and freedom of choice is granted. This is not a paradox. It is a description of our responsibilities in a world of relentless circumstances. Which is why the next part of the Mishnah is so inspiring. Uvatov ha'olam nidon. And the world is judged in goodness, and everything is in accordance to the preponderance of deed. At first, this seems like that offensive false claim that people often make in difficult situations where they say, oh, everything happens for a reason, no one gets more than they can handle. And I think that even Rabbi Akiva would never have agreed with those ideas. Rabbi Akiva is a man who gave his life to the Jewish people's second revolt against Rome. Spoiler alert, the Jews lost both of those revolts. And he was, even before being tortured to death by the Romans, Rabbi Akiva's life was very far from easy. The greatest gift that Rabbi Akiva gave to the Jews who came after him, up to our own time, was what I consider the secret to Jewish survival and flourishing, which is hope. Not hope in terms of a blind faith in God or fate, but hope in what dedicated humans can do together to shape their shared future. God did not give us an inevitable multiverse. God gave us a world that we are responsible for. I hope we will all merit to have the world that we leave behind us judged by the actions we take and the choices we make.